Thank you very much, Itai. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I've been watching this space for a little while on the web and on LinkedIn and so on, and seeing it evolve. And yeah, I was really delighted to be invited to be here. And as you said, we've had discussions in the past, and so this is and I really like this format. So this for me is the nearest to kind of like a salon on the web that you can get. I presented at things called salons before, but they're not so much. It's just being shouted at by people in academia. But this seems like a genuine salon in the sense of different perspectives, different people coming together, and genuinely, like you set it up, with questions as opposed to just a set of boring talks. So I haven't prepared slides. It was a beautiful presentation by Susan with lots of beautiful images to evoke ideas, and it was a good start to this. But I really purposefully just wanted to talk for a short period and discuss, open to questions. And yeah, I guess I can start off with Susan's end question was, I think it was, how can we, I think if we go back to a slide, lots of memory test of like, how can we open our minds and hearts to different ways of knowing across this sector? Yeah, that's a hard one, isn't it? And I think one of the first things to reflect on is, who are we speaking to when we think about this? And we think about blind spots. The premise of today is kind of like, what are science's blind spots? And obviously in relation to the center. And science has hundreds and thousands of blind spots. That's kind of how the way it works. So it's really blind spots in relation to the aims and objectives here of building, of creating better spaces, I think is the question, but really around the science. And I really, just to reflect, to go into what I was going to say in my short summary and discussion, is that point about different ways of knowing is critical, that Susan was bringing towards, that if you just take a sort of top-down standard view, you ask a question, you test the hypothesis, you get the data, it does or does not prove that hypothesis true, and you move on. It's just one way of thinking about things. So it's really important to reflect on that. So in my short reflection, just to come into it, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I've spent 25 years studying how the brain operates, in particular in relation to space. So for that career, I've been really interested in the kind of questions around design and the construction and architecture of spaces, but I have no background in that. So I kind of come in super naive. I've spent a lot of time talking to very smart people and enjoying learning from them, but I am very naive. And the more you go on in life, the more you do science, so you really appreciate how little you know about things. And so I just want to start by highlighting that I have this knowledge in brain sciences that I'll discuss now, but I'm really interested in, and the value of these discussions on this Lighthouse are like different perspectives and people who come with different expertise is fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to pick up on two blind spots to now go from the pre-on. One of them comes from this book, The Blind Spot, and it's mirror reflected in mine. I don't know if it's all in reverse, but there's a book called The Blind Spot. I don't know if Itai, were you aware of this book when you set up the meeting?
I was aware of it after I'd already thought of the title. So when I searched the title, I saw there was a book, and yeah, interesting to hear.
Yeah, so it's a thick hardback book. It just came out from MIT Press, and it exactly is tapping into this question that Itai has posed here about science's blind spots. The perspective that these three authors come to on it is that there's one major blind spot, which Susan had picked up in her talk at the beginning. Actually, it was one of the topics she covered, which is the phrase human experience. And these authors in this quite extensive book really focus on the fact that across all the scientific disciplines, human experience is often jettisoned or not considered well enough, or not really picked up on or dealt with badly, would be their perspective. And then the point blind spot is, like, in many cases, not even thought about. And they start with kind of high energy physics, going down to things like the quantum scale, where it does matter that if you can't tell both position and momentum at the same time at the quantum level, and so you have to choose what you're going to do, what you're going to measure, and that's subjective. That's a personal decision about what it is you want to know about the physics of the universe. But then they of course get into the topic we're interested in, this, which is related to how neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, things that can tell us about human experience, they, despite that being about humans and how humans behave and the cognition we have, they highlight that a vast amount of that research ignores human experience. And the point, and I, as a scientist growing up being trained in cognitive neuroscience, I'd say it's true. There's a lot of experiments where we just focus on very niche behavior that you can measure in a laboratory, reproduce it, test the hypothesis about what exactly is going to happen in that. And it jettisons the, what does this mean for everyday experience? Or the fact that, half the participants who came in to do your study just hated it. And the whole time they were doing it, they were thinking about their next job after the thing they're doing. And this has no real relevance to them. So that's kind of that's what this book argues is a major blind spot. And I think it probably is a good one to reflect. So I in the kind of provocations, I think everyone coming into this meeting would be kind of like, think about the science you covered or read and think quite deeply about that human experience question. How is this related to that? Because it really does, when you think about better design, like improving the way in which we design our buildings and cities and the environments we live in, not having a check on human experience is just crazy. But the important points here is that it seems obvious. You have to do design, but the science that you're using to build the evidence base for it, that Itai sort of brought in and Susan covered, if that doesn't include consideration of human experience, which the argument this book and I would make is it doesn't, then you have a problem. And so it's a blind spot that we need to kind of think a bit more about and maybe come into some really specifics. So just to take an example, there's a cool line of research on reality monitoring. How do you know what's real and what is not real? Great question. But a lot of it's done looking at computer screens in the dark with things being flashed up. And it's probably not, it's very interesting work and you can replicate things and you can follow it. But how it really relates to reality monitoring in the real world and what goes wrong in schizophrenia or other conditions, it's very unclear. So again, the kind of blind spot could be applied there, that those people working on some of these topics aren't really considering human experience. So this is the first topic. I'll just add a little bit to that in some research I did a while back, I got really interested in this question. The question is like, how do you trust people? So if you say, we want to know more about people's experience, well, one way is to ask people, what were you thinking or how are you feeling? And there's a real reluctance to do that in science because it's so messy. Some people can tell you what they were feeling. Certainly if you said, oh, what were you feeling yesterday at 4 o'clock? I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what I was feeling yesterday at 4 o'clock. But if you do a particular task well, you can start to ask questions around how people are thinking or feeling. That does give you reliable data, but it requires very carefully thinking about it. But I would say there's very few studies that have really undertaken that. So in some past work I did, and in going forward, I did a study with London taxi drivers where I tested their ability to drive through a simulation of London and asked them what they were thinking, and learned a lot about what was going on for them from that thinking process, that description of their thoughts. But if it took the same paradigm and applied it in different places, it didn't work. And it didn't work, I think, because you need to get the context right. You need to have experiments that really tap into real world knowledge, real world experience, and in that case, expertise. So that's one of my blind spot questions to go and discuss is related to this book by Adam Frank, Marcello Glaser, and Evan Thompson, The Blind Spot. The second blind spot I'd want to pick up on, and I'm going to finish and hand over to Colin for his discussion, I think also taps into something Susan started out on, was the different types of ways of knowing. And that really comes down to a lot of the science we do around understanding people and space and so on. Pretty much most of it, a very large amount, ignores intercultural differences. Just assumes we want to study people as people. Part of that comes from past research with rats or other animals where they don't tend to have that much culture. They can do, but the laboratory settings, they don't. And so there's a kind of, let's just assume they're organisms and study like humans as an organism. And then why would we worry so much about intercultural differences? And I think that's changing. So, and I'd just like to drag out 3 different types of intercultural difference, so you can provoke discussion around that. One is kind of between nations, so different countries with different cultures that exist within those countries. So, for example, if I think about Scandinavian countries, they have a different ethos about how human people should be treated and how you might build environments for people compared to, say, where I'm sitting in Britain. It's not so huge, but there is a distinct difference in approach to thinking about people. And we can see this because we started to do studies in my research team where we look at populations of people performing tasks across nations. we can see the inequalities that exist in the real world spilling over into the scientific data when we look at measurements of people's behavior. So there are these intercultural differences across nations that just don't tend to get considered. Just to tick out one of the specific ones is the way in which men and women might explore a space when they enter a building. For many people might be very similar, but if you start to really go across different nations, you may find big differences in the way in which people are expected to move in spaces that you might not have anticipated if you just studied one group. It makes the research expensive because you need to go into different cultures, but it's something we should be investing in, and we should be collaborating around the world to make that more possible. The other more obvious one even perhaps is indigenous groups. So I think a big blind spot is not just we're ignoring the human experience, but we're ignoring the fact that people have radically different human experiences when you consider indigenous communities. And what I mean by indigenous communities are people who, like the indigenous communities in Australia, for example, who have historically been, many of these groups treated extremely badly by colonial powers. So there are issues around that. But the understanding their perspective and their way of looking at the world, I think, is not only a useful, like, to incorporate it for, inclusivity questions and how we treat people and how we involve others, but actually for insights. A lot of thinking comes from Western science, but there are different ways of thinking about the world around us and the way in which we might take care of the world around us and embed ourselves in the world around us, or think about our own existence, that come from different ways of understanding cultures. It's expensive, very expensive to do studies across nations and with indigenous groups. But again, I think it's really important. And then maybe the one that is not so obvious, but in terms of cultures, is that people take on different professional roles. You can get trained as an architect, and that will come with certain cultural training. You can train as a neuroscientist. That will bring you certain cultural aspects to the way you think. And I think we need to sort of include thinking around that in the way we do the science. On a very basic level, that's kind of like taking account of it as a variable in the science. If you tested 20 people and 10 were architects and 10 were neuroscientists, you want to know that, and you want to think about what that means. So 3 different types of intercultural differences that I think are ignored largely by the kind of neuroscience, cognitive science that we do, that are starting to change.